we're going to dive into one of history's greatest and kind of tragic ironies. It's about a code, an unbreakable code that was key to winning a war. But it's also about the devastating price the men who created it had to pay for keeping it secret. Yeah, we're talking about the incredible story of the Navajo Code Talkers. So, let me ask you something. What if you did something huge that literally changed the course of history, but you could never, ever tell anyone about it? Not a single soul. How would that even feel? Well, for a very real group of World War II heroes, this wasn't some thought experiment. This was their life.
You know, when you think about victory in World War II, what comes to mind? It's probably those classic images, right? Ticker tape parades, cheering crowds, that famous flag raising at Iwo Jima. All very public, very celebrated. But what's wild is that at the exact same time, there was another group of heroes, just as crucial to that victory, who were ordered to just disappear, to melt into the shadows, their story completely locked away by the same country they fought so hard to save.
So, what was this incredible top-secret achievement? Well, it was a code. But this wasn't just any code. This was a weapon of war so powerful that its very existence was seen as a danger to national security. What the Code Talkers did was, honestly, a work of genius. They took their native language, Dene Bizad, or what most of us know as Navajo, and turned it into a military code. And it was perfect. It was fast, it was super accurate, and it was completely, totally unbreakable. See, because Navajo was an unwritten oral language, the Japanese cryptographers had nothing to work with. They couldn't crack it, no way. This code was basically one of the master keys that unlocked victory in the Pacific. And their reward for all of this, for saving countless lives, it wasn't a medal, it wasn't a parade, nope. It was a lifelong gag order. They were sworn to absolute secrecy, and the threat hanging over their heads was treason. I mean, that's the most serious charge a country can level against its own citizens. That was their thank you.
But why? Why go to such extreme lengths? To really get that, you have to understand the world these men came home to. It wasn't a world of peace and celebration. It was a world absolutely drenched in paranoia and secrets. Yeah, the world they came back to was already deep in the grip of the Cold War. There was this intense fear, this deep suspicion everywhere. You had the Iron Curtain in Europe, and right here at home, you had McCarthyism whipping up this culture of paranoia. Everybody was worried about Soviet spies. Your neighbor could be a spy. Secrecy wasn't just a policy. For the government, secrecy was safety. And this whole era created two totally different kinds of secret keepers. On one hand, you've got the Rosenbergs. They were executed for betrayal, for giving away America's atomic secrets. On the other hand, you have the Code Talkers, who showed the ultimate loyalty by keeping America's secrets. Think about that contrast. One group was punished for talking, the other group was punished by their silence. And the execution of the Rosenbergs, wow, that was a chilling, very public spectacle. It was the government sending a loud, brutal message to absolutely everyone, including the Code Talkers. This is what happens when you leak our secrets. So for them, the threat of treason wasn't just words on a page. They saw the consequences. They knew speaking out wasn't just forbidden, it was deadly. Okay, so this national obsession with keeping secrets, it came at a staggering personal cost, a price that was paid in silence by the men who had to carry that burden every single day. 23 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. 23 years, that's a whole generation. For that long, these men were forced to carry the war home with them in total silence. They couldn't explain their nightmares to their wives. They couldn't tell their kids that their dad was a hero. They couldn't even talk to a doctor about what they'd been through, which basically shut down any chance of getting help. And this goes even deeper. In Dene culture, there's a vital tradition for warriors returning from battle. It's a cleansing ceremony called the Enemy Way, and it's meant to help them process the trauma and spiritually come home. But here's the impossible question. How can you even begin a healing ceremony for a warrior forbidden to talk about? You can't. And that secrecy, it blocked that essential path to healing, causing what we now understand as moral injury. It's a really deep spiritual kind of wound. So while these men were struggling completely alone and in silence, the rest of America was rebuilding, moving on. The famous GI Bill was in full swing, It was literally building the American middle class, giving other vets a real shot at prosperity with college tuition, home loans, the whole deal. But here's the catch. To get any of those GI Bill benefits, you had to prove what you did in the war. And on paper, the Code Talkers' incredibly important, highly specialized role It just didn't exist. Their records were stamped classified. Their official job was often listed as something like basic infantry, or, get this, sometimes even janitor. Just think about that for a second. The very act of being loyal, of keeping their oath of silence, directly led to economic hardship for them and their families. The very men whose secret weapon helped create the conditions for that post-war economic boom were completely locked out of it. And it wasn't just them, it was their whole communities. So what finally happens when a secret this massive is let out of the bag? Well, it kicks off this incredibly slow, often painful process of basically declassifying history itself.
And man, was it a slow journey. The code itself gets declassified in 1968, but it wasn't until 2001, that's 56 years after the war ended, that the original Code Talkers were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. For so many of them, that recognition just came way, way too late. And we really need to be clear about why the secret was let out. It wasn't some noble act of recognition. It wasn't the government deciding, hey, it's time to honor these heroes. Nope, it was because technology had moved on. Computers, satellites, they made a human-based code like this obsolete. The truth wasn't set free because it was the right thing to do. It was set free because it wasn't considered valuable anymore. But the emotional release was just immense and immediate. At their very first reunion in 1969, you had these old men just weeping, breaking down after decades of carrying this weight. It was the first time they could finally turn to their families, to their kids and grandkids, and say what they actually did. That they weren't just farmers or shepherds, they were heroes. And in an oral culture, being able to tell your story, that's everything. That is how healing begins. This also led to this profound sense of cultural validation. And the irony here is just staggering. I mean, think about it. The very same Navajo language that the US government had spent decades trying to stamp out in its boarding schools, literally beating children for speaking it, was now being hailed as a key to winning the war. Something that was once a source of punishment and shame was suddenly transformed into this incredible symbol of pride and resilience. You know, the story of the Code Talkers really forces us to look at a conflict that is, if anything, even more intense today. They were considered patriots because they kept secrets for the government. Now you have whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, who some call patriots and others call traitors for revealing government secrets. It's the exact same tension, isn't it? That line between loyalty to the state and loyalty to what you believe is the truth. And all of this really boils down to one final, powerful question. The government classified their actions, their history, even their identities, all in the name of national security. But does that mean the government gets to own your story? When you look at what the Code Talkers went through, their legacy seems to make a pretty powerful case that maybe the most important freedom we have is the freedom to tell our own truth.